Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to Fundamentals for Startups, a CoMotion Labs production. My name is Dilip Sivam. I'm the entrepreneur in residence at the Washington Clean Energy Testbed, which is part of the UW Clean Energy Institute. So if you joined us before, you know that CoMotion is a multi-industry incubator hosting early-stage startups from both inside and outside the UW community. We have 3 incubators in 2 locations on campus. Life Sciences and Hardware is down in Fluke Hall, and Tech is here in Startup Hall. If you're a founder looking for a community, CoMotion would love to talk to you. This event, Fundamentals for Startups, is a regular lecture series open to anyone interested in learning about entrepreneurship or building a startup. Every week, we bring in experts with diverse perspectives and experiences to share insights, inspire action, and offer space for questions. So just a few announcements here. All the Fundamentals for Startups presentations are archived on our YouTube channel and on the CoMotion website, where you can filter by topic. To learn about and register for future Fundamentals events, visit CoMotion Labs online and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next Wednesday, February 14th, CoMotion Labs is hosting a startup career and internship fair. If you are hiring or looking to be hired, see Fanny in the back of the room for more information. She's waving her hand back there. So today, I'm very excited to introduce Vicki Hunt, Chief Data Officer at the climate tech startup Crosswalk Labs. Vicki leads a team of software developers and technical folks who turn emissions data into insightful insights for cities and local governments. She's also a third-term city council member of the city of Issaquah, and today she'll talk about skills and strategies for gathering the support of people above you and how to foster enthusiasm in those who report to you. Welcome, Vicki. And I will also just give in a personal plug. Worked with Vicki for many years. I know she's really good at this stuff, so listen to what she has to say.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Dilip. Really excited to be here at Startup Hall talking with you all today about managing up and down for stronger teams. All right. My name is Vicki Hunt, and I have a couple different hats. And I'm not going to talk too much about any of these roles, but they all do inform how I think about developing relationships with the people that I work with and how I work with folks. I am the Chief Data Officer for Crosswalk Labs. Crosswalk Labs is a startup, and we provide greenhouse gas emissions data to primarily the public sector, so cities, counties, and local governments. And the cities, counties, and local governments that are our clients are able to use this data for making better decisions in their policy making, as well as for developing inventories or for communicating with their constituents. We also have some private sector clients that are using our data to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions footprint, for example. With my other hat, I am an elected official, a city council member for the city of Issaquah, Washington, which is a beautiful city about a 30-minute car ride away from here. If you ever want to go paragliding, it's a beautiful place to try that out. And as a city council member in Issaquah, I have the opportunity to work with people in many different sectors. So I get to work with people in the buildings community, in the business community, environmental community, all to get different perspectives, because all of those perspectives help me better do my job as a policymaker and to make better decisions as I represent my community. So this is a picture of me with my Crosswalk Labs Chief Data Officer hat on, and a picture of me as a city council member. And here we were receiving an award for being a LEED certified city, as a leading environmental city. I'm not going to talk too much about either of these roles. I'm going to talk more about how being in these roles informs the way that I work with others. But I did want to offer that if either of these are of interest to you, please feel free to reach out, and I would love to talk with you more. The last thing about me is I have a PhD in ecology, and ecology is the study of natural systems. This does, I think, also inform how I think about things as ecosystems. There are lots of interconnected pieces within organizations that are sort of similar to ecosystems. So if you strengthen one part of an organization, it can have impacts on the rest of the organization. So here we are in Startup Hall, and I am the Chief Data Officer for a startup. Startups have some unique characteristics that I think make the managing for stronger teams especially important. This is a definition from Forbes. Startups are young companies founded to develop a unique product or service, bring it to market, and make it irresistible and irreplaceable for customers. So a couple things that I wanted to point out in this definition. Startups are young companies, so they're growing. They're in their early formative stages. They're trying to bring a unique product to market. This is an inherently super challenging thing. It's something that isn't in the market already. There's a lot of need for adapting and for figuring out the fit of the product in the market, and there's a lot of decisions that need to be made quickly to make sure that you have a viable strategy as a startup. I also liked this Investopedia image of a startup as a burning money match. Like, it's just a hand holding a match of money that's on fire. So startups are, I think, often uniquely on a limited runway. You have to figure out how to get your product to market and figure out that match of the client and the product, and you also have a short runway to do that. So speed and change and disruption is expected with startups. People have multiple responsibilities oftentimes, and they may have to juggle those responsibilities, so that may be an important context. Somebody, you might be talking with them in one role, but they may also have several other roles that they're having to manage. Bandwidth is real, so while if you're interacting with somebody and you think a particular element of the company is most important to you, it may be that they have several other things that they're responsible for, and they may only have a certain amount of bandwidth to dedicate to that particular aspect of the company. Complexity and hierarchy are oftentimes in flux in startups, and that's because, again, startups are young companies. They're growing, they have to change, they have to adapt to market conditions, and because of those reasons, oftentimes the different levels in the startup may be changing and other adaptations may need to be made. So unlike a large established company, oftentimes things change in startups. And for all these reasons, efficient communication is super important for startups. The way I see it, managing is really about being a leader in your organization, wherever you are in your organization. I firstly wanted to also check in with you all about how many of you are currently working in a startup? Great. And then have worked for a startup? Okay. And then interested in working in a startup in the future? This could be overlapping. Very good. So I think most people fell into at least one or more of those categories. So wherever you are in your organization, I think that managing is really about being a leader and taking on leadership responsibilities. So these concepts will apply to you wherever you are in your organization. Today I'm mostly going to be focusing on how to communicate with folks across the organization in a way that makes the team stronger and productive. So throughout the talk, you'll hear me talk about communication a lot. And I'll be focusing mostly on managing to direct reports, which is also called managing down, and managing up, which is where you're communicating with your manager, the person who you report to. But there are other kinds of management as well. If you think about managing to customers, communicating with customers or clients, managing across to peers, or managing to partners and suppliers and other people in your organization. all of these kinds of communication adjustment techniques can apply. When I first became a manager, I was given this book, The New 1-Minute Manager, by somebody who had managed many people for many years. And it is an interesting thing becoming a manager because often you aren't taught about this in school. You just get the job and you become a manager. And so when I became a manager, I thought I learned best from reading and from books, and so I wanted a recommendation on a book, and this is the book that I received, and I did really learn a lot, and I still reference it, reference the concepts in this book. One of my very first people that I reported to said that, in his opinion, the most important job of a manager is to be like an umbrella, and by that he meant that if there are bureaucracy or negativity coming down from the top of an organization, it is the role of a manager to make sure that that isn't negatively impacting the people that are reporting up to you. So if there's, stuff that's being figured out and red tape and problems at the top of the org, as a manager, you have to try to manage that, but you also have to be an umbrella to make sure that that isn't negatively affecting the people that you're managing. So that's number one, be an umbrella. That was told to me by the very first person that I worked for, and I've always thought that that's a good check. So make sure you are being an umbrella. The second thing is really listening and asking for input. So if you have a one-on-one with somebody, really turning off your phone, not checking your email, just having a one-on-one conversation can be really important, and you can get different kinds of feedback and different kinds of interactions if you're really giving that person your full attention. My PhD advisor, I recall he had many students that he was advising and lots of things, lots and lots of projects that he was working on. But when I had a one-on-one with him, he gave me his full undivided attention. And I think we all probably can think of somebody who, when we meet with them, have your full undivided attention, and that can be a really positive way to develop a rapport with somebody and to develop that trust. As a manager, very important to not be micromanaging, but rather to empower people to make their own decisions and to encourage them to make their own decisions and encourage dissent if it's needed. If there's something that they disagree with, that they would actually voice that, and to flag issues. So how do you do all of these things? A lot of it comes down to adjusting your communication style depending on the situation. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking through some ways that you can do that. Okay, this is a graphic from the 1-Minute Manager book. It's also in lots of different management guidelines and management books. So if you look up situational leadership, there are lots of think pieces and articles about this. The main idea is that depending on the situation, you change the way that you're interacting with the person that you manage. So, for example, I was thinking about situational leadership in general. I live in Issaquah, and every morning I take my kid, or oftentimes will get up, the first thing I do is take my kids to school. I live on a mountain in Issaquah where there are lots of mountains and lots of trees. And so typically there's a view of these trees, like the silhouette of the trees poking up over the fog and the mist over the mountains. And oftentimes I see that and I think, wow, I live in a beautiful place, like how amazing that I get to see these beautiful silhouettes of the trees, and awesome. But then sometimes, same view, I think it's more like the opening credits of one of those Scandinavian crime shows. It's like more ominous with the dark silhouettes of the trees. And so that's purely situational. It's just probably that I have some things I have to do later in the day that I'm nervous about or something. So I see the same thing and it's got a different reaction. So this is about different situations that a person may be in, but it's not that one person ever like fits completely into one of these boxes. The other thing is that
We're gonna switch your mics.
I switch my mic. Okay.
Here you go. Sorry. They're gonna turn it on.
Okay. All right. Sorry about all the feedback. Oh, I think this will be cleaner. Great. So one of the other important things before I get into how to use this chart is that it's not at all about judgment, right? It's not a judgment about whether you see the trees as a Scandinavian crime show opening credits or like beautiful scenery. It's just the situation that you're in. So and again, it's not that one person can ever fit into one of these boxes. It's more that given the situation, given the task, given what you're working on, you can think about which situation you're in and use this as a guideline for how you would interact. So with that in mind, and it's not about judgment, the first box, which is the red box, is also referred to as enthusiastic beginner. So this would be where you're managing somebody who's starting off on a certain task or a certain job responsibility, really excited about it, but doesn't yet have the skill set or doesn't yet have a lot of experience doing this given task. So in this case, if you are working with somebody who's an enthusiastic beginner for the given task, the role that you could take on as their manager would be to be in the sort of directing realm. So they probably don't need a lot of support or encouragement because they're enthusiastic, but they do need direction. So they need to be told, okay, in this situation, these are the specific things that you would need to do. This is the kind of information you would need to look up. This is the kind of meeting you should have with the client, whatever it may be, but you may have to actually give that direction. So not support because they are already enthusiastic, but more of the direction. Then moving into the orange, this is a person that is sometimes referred to in the situational leadership jargon as a disillusioned learner. Not judging, but once you've sort of acquired some skills, maybe the enthusiasm has dropped off a little bit and they've gained some skills, but they still need some directing. So in this case, if you are interacting with somebody who's in this disillusioned learner quadrant, you would want to make sure that you're giving direction, but also giving that support. So encouraging them that this is something that they can do and they've already made a lot of progress, and here are some specific things that they should do in this particular case. From there, the orange, or the yellow, is capable but cautious contributor. So if you think about somebody, once they've gained a lot of skills and they've developed a lot of competency in a given area, they may still, because they haven't been doing it maybe as long as somebody else, or maybe they're just not sure of where they're whether their position in the organization allows them to make decisions yet. These are people who are very competent, but they need that support to actually go ahead and make the decisions and do the things they need to do. So in this quadrant, this is more high support, but low direction. So really just encouraging the person to make their decision, and then kind of stepping back and not telling them what to do. And then the last quadrant is delegating. So this would be somebody who is a self-reliant achiever. They are both competent and they have the motivation to do it themselves. And so these people need very little, except kind of probably the listening and the going back and forth and making sure that if they need resources or if they need input, that you are there for them. But it's both low direction and low support in that particular quadrant. So this is really empowering, and where you would want to empower the person and let them do great things. So one of the ways that you as a manager can be sure to give feedback and also receive feedback is through structured interactions. In some cases, I think structured interactions is really important. In startups, often there's a lot of change and things moving fast, and it can be nice to have that check-in on the calendar where you know you're going to have an opportunity to meet with your boss or meet with your one-on-one, your direct reports. So that regular cadence can be really needed and can be really nice, and then as needed or to put out fires can also be useful. So to put out fires meaning as something comes up that you absolutely need to have a check-in for, finding a time on the calendar. But I do think that oftentimes, given everything else that can be going on at a startup, it can be nice to have that regular one-on-one, or maybe it's also a written update, depending on how people want to have their information conveyed, or a shared calendar, whatever is most mutually beneficial for the manager and for the report. I think it's really important and easier said than done sometimes to be very intentional about the way that you're communicating. So oftentimes if there is a one-on-one in the calendar, having that structure is helpful, but also thinking ahead of time, what do I really need to convey in this moment to this person? It's important that it be clear and succinct and specific. And there are two other things that I wanted to point out about being intentional with your feedback. One is there's a lot of literature that shows that giving purely critical feedback rarely improves performance. I think we can probably all think of times where we've received critical feedback, just something didn't go well. And it tends to both feel better and also be more productive to give that feedback in a way that you're providing a suggestion of how to do something differently, or giving direction, or doing something other than just purely critical. The other thing is that giving a piece of critical feedback and positive feedback, just sandwiching, there's also a lot of literature that shows those don't cancel out, because when the person hears the critical feedback, often that's what they focus on, and they don't really then think about the positive feedback, and it doesn't make the whole interaction go any differently actually than if you just gave the negative feedback. So feedback is definitely necessary, and sometimes it is important to flag issues, as I was saying, but I think being really intentional about how you do that is very important. So now that I've said what not to do, what can you do if you have an issue and you need to give critical feedback? If we think back to this situational leadership example, if the issue is that the person doesn't know what to do and maybe hasn't yet developed the skills and needs to have more of those options for how to proceed, that probably means they're in the red box where they need direction. So in that case, you can provide alternative approaches, or you can tell them what you would do in that situation and just say, okay, so this is what happened. Here's what I would do right now. If it's somebody who's in the orange box, so this is the disillusioned learner, in that case, you can be more in a coaching role. So you can say, this is more what I would do, but also encourage them that that they are able to do this. They've developed these skills. Here's how you could use the skills that you have to solve this problem that you're encountering. And then supporting is the way that you can interact with somebody who's more in the yellow, which are the capable but cautious contributors. So this is more where if something didn't go well, it might be because the person didn't have the confidence yet. And so then just encouraging them, you're reminding them of all that they've achieved, all the skills that they have, and encouraging them to go ahead and keep going, making the decision, and more in that supportive or positive reinforcement role. And then lastly, the empowering and delegating for somebody who is capable, also is motivated, but just needs to have that extra empowerment or boost. And that in that case, it may be that they need to have additional responsibility allocated to them. Maybe they didn't actually have the ability to do what they wanted to do because of some other restriction within the organization. So in that case, it's really just clearing roadblocks for them, or determining what the issue was and setting them up for success. So now that we've talked a little bit about some tools for managing direct reports, managing down, I wanted to talk about managing up. So this is where you are talking with your manager or your boss. Firstly, what it's not. It's not managing or overriding your manager, and it's not manipulating or going over your boss's head. When I was thinking about pop culture references for this talk, I thought of a lot of examples of bad examples of managing up. You know, like in the office, there's all kinds of relationships that are not to be emulated. But I struggled a little bit actually to think of good examples of managing up in pop culture, because I think it's funny when it's gone awry. It's entertaining. But I did come up with one, and actually after the talk, or if anybody has any, if you think of any examples of good managing up, I would be interested to hear them. So one that I did come up with was from Parks and Recreation, and it was Leslie and Anne on Parks and Recreation, because Leslie, as the manager, she has some blind spots, and Anne definitely flags things when there are problems, but she also goes with Leslie to meetings, and she really tries to understand what all the issues are and tries to understand Leslie's perspective. But she also, when she sees something wrong, she says it loudly and clearly that something's wrong. So managing up, adjusting communication style should sound familiar. That was one of the big pieces of the managing down as well. And I also think it's, again, really important to be intentional in your communication with your manager, and again, structure matters. So your manager may have many other reports, may be having lots of other responsibilities. There may be many other things going on in the organization. And so having either regular check-ins or having check-ins on a certain day. I know some managers want to structure all of their one-on-ones on a certain day, so being sure that you fit into whatever that scheduling is can be helpful. But really, the intentional piece is that you think ahead of time about what you need to communicate. Setting expectations, by that I mean you know more about certain aspects of what's going on than your manager. You know more about whatever the specific task that you've been working on, for example. So I think it's really important to remember that you have information your manager doesn't have. And so managing up a lot of times is making sure that they know what you know that's important for them to know. For example, they may be talking with stakeholders or with other people outside of the company about when a given product is going to be ready to go to market. And if you have technical information about, well, we have a problem on our side, we're working through some bugs, and we think it's going to set us back a couple months, and maybe it's that you're in the middle as a manager in the middle of an organization and you know that your team has reported that they're going to need some more time for something, it's super important to convey that, because otherwise your manager won't know that. They'll go out to external partners and say we're on track, and that can set you up for a lot of problems. There's another management book called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team and How to Overcome Them. And in that, it talks a lot about how trust, or absence of trust, is the basis of most problems. And trust, conversely, is the basis of most successful interactions in an organization. So to build that trust, you have to be able to set those expectations realistically. That's one of the main ways I think that trust can be broken down, is if you don't set the right expectation, and then you either aren't able to perform at that expectation, or you haven't conveyed that your team is having issues performing to meet that expectation. Similarly, flagging issues clearly and proactively. Nobody likes surprises, especially in a startup, and always driving towards decisions, meaning that you may have information, again, that's contributing towards a certain decision that your manager won't have. And so just keeping track of, if a decision needs to be made, these are the pieces of information that I need to give to my manager to help them make the decision, and make sure that they are on track to make that decision, and that there's not other questions or other things that need to get answered. So I think that all of these management of different communication styles and adjustment of communication styles should be helpful no matter where you are in the organization. But at the same time, it can be nice to kind of flex your muscles and try different roles. And so there are many opportunities, I think, to be a leader in your org, regardless of where you are on the org chart. And sometimes those are opportunities that present themselves that you can just jump on. So for example, if there's a project management opportunity, that's a great way to be a leader, and to take responsibility for a specific project, a technical project, for example, and use some of these tools to adjust your communication depending on who you're working with and drive that project to completion. Also filling in for somebody, perhaps your manager has to be out for a while, and so you can offer that you would like to step in and take on those responsibilities for a while, or temporary roles. This is an example where they're very short notice. They wanted speakers for a rally, and so and also they were making time for another speaker who was stuck in traffic, and so I offered to speak. And so I think those sorts of opportunities, when they present themselves to step into a different leadership role than you might have routinely, can be really, really useful. So then it gives you a bank of experiences to look back on as you go forward in your professional development. I'm sure there are other things I hadn't thought of in terms of other opportunities, but you can probably all think of different things in your specific startups or your specific lines of work that would lend themselves to developing more of these management experiences. If we think back to the startup as the hand holding the match made of money that's just on fire, startups don't have a lot of time to waste on things. And so if there's something going wrong, it is super important in any organization, but I think especially important in a startup to actually throw the flag on something that's going wrong. The way that you can actually do this and feel empowered to do this is by developing a rapport with your manager and with your team, so you are comfortable to actually flag things when they need to be flagged. And this needs to happen regardless of whether it's something your manager is doing or their manager is doing, or wherever there's an issue in the organization. So how do you get to a place where you're comfortable flagging, even if it's something that your manager is doing that you know is hurting the overall productivity of the company, or is just making for a less strong team than you know you could be. One of the tools that you can develop is learning the different languages that are spoken across your org. And so I don't mean literally different languages, although maybe if there are different languages, that should also be taken into account. But what I mean more are that there are different languages in terms of there might be corporate talk, technical talk, legal talk, if there's subject matter, different acronyms that are known to people that really know that subject matter. And being able to be multilingual in that space can be really important and can show that you are trying to understand the way that people are communicating in a different part of the org. And I think that can also help build trust. So taking time to figure out how are people talking about these issues in this part of the organization. If they're using a lot of legal terms, trying to understand what those terms are and being able to understand the importance and speak in that language, that can be very useful. And I think this is especially important in very technical startups, which I imagine is very applicable to you all, because technical people often have a language of their own. And they have to talk with people that are in other parts of the org that may not know all the same acronyms, may not know all the same technical terms, but they still have to get their point across because that point is very important. They may know about specific technical barriers to progress, specific issues that are coming up that need to be taken into account for the overall roadmap of the company. So to be able to communicate those in a way that people who don't know the specific terminology of your field can understand can be very important and can be one way that you can flag issues in a way that is productive and actually gets change, it actually achieves that change that you want to achieve. So how do we get to this good place where you're comfortable flagging issues as they come up, flagging issues if it's something that your manager is doing? It really does come down to trust, and you're much better equipped to raise red flags if you're starting from a place of mutual trust and respect. This is a screen grab from a show called The Good Place, and one thing that I found out when grabbing this picture is that for a lot of people, this is off-putting because the height of the two pillars is different. So it's like not symmetrical, and that really bothers some people. It's not something that bothers me, and you can probably tell from my slide design that things are not symmetrical and moving around. But for some people, that's really important. And so I think just figuring out what are those things that are important, building that trust, really understanding where people are coming from, and using that in your interactions is really important. So developing that rapport, understanding where people are coming from, understanding that people have other things going on in their lives, and that over time you can develop that trust in decision making, so that when an issue does come up, you are comfortable to flag that and raise that to your manager or to your manager's manager or whoever it may be. This is another book. Again, I learn best from books, I think, that has a list of things that you can do to strengthen the organization's culture, and these can be done by, regardless of where you are in your organization, you can promote some of these things or do some of these things to help strengthen your organization's culture. So a few that I wanted to flag. One is say I don't know and say I'm sorry. So if you don't know something, being sure to tell that and not try to cover it up, I think can be a good way to develop trust. There are several other ones on here. Holding one-on-one meetings we discussed, and being really listening and being really intentional. And then there are many other ones that are here about measuring and providing feedback. But I think this book overall is interesting. It won't apply necessarily to startups. A lot of them apply to bigger companies, but it could give you an idea of some of the different things that you could do to help strengthen your culture in the company. And I'm sure there are many other specific things that you've thought about in your own startups about how you could develop that trust across your organization. So with that, I wanted to make sure to give some time for any questions that you might have. And I wanted to thank you again for taking the time with me on a Friday mid-afternoon to listen to these thoughts about managing up and down for stronger organizations. Thank you.
Oh, what have you noticed being at a startup and also being in government? Like, how have the differences in what you've talked about today, what have you seen? So more honest in some places versus others? Interesting.
So I am an elected official, so I'm not working within the city, overall. But I think in a startup, you are trying to figure out how to do a novel thing. You're trying to figure out how to bring a new product to market. You're trying to figure out how to productionize something that hasn't been productionized before. And in a city, the processes are a lot more established. So you know that you have to pave the roads. You know that you have to fund these services for the people in the city. And so I think that all of the while all of the adjustment of communication styles does apply in both cases, and I think is beneficial in both cases, I think that in the startup, because there's a lot of change to try to figure out how to do that novel new thing, and also you're trying to be, in some ways, disruptive. You're trying to bring a new thing to market, so there's some inherent disruption there. I think because of those things, having those adjustments and being more flexible rapidly is super important in the startup, because you just encounter more change within the organization and therefore have to adjust your communication styles more quickly, I think.
I've got a question. CoMotion staff over here. Do you have any recommendations for managing up or managing down when there are kind of historical power dynamics in play, like managing up, for example, if it's an older man who might be paternalistic with you or some dynamic like that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. One of the things that I think is really important is coming from a place of starting from a place of believing the positive intent. So starting with a place of, there's this inherent power dynamic, but I have this concern and I feel I need to raise it. And so starting from that place of the positive, that they will listen and that they do want to also make the org a better place. And so just starting from that place that you have a shared interest in strengthening the overall performance of the team. I do think also that development of that trust is probably just that much more important when overcoming a power dynamic that is uncomfortable. Getting to know that person's perspective, and that the person who's in the position of power is also doing that deep listening and really understanding the perspective of the person that they're listening to, goes both ways. But I think that development of trust is super important, and you might take extra care to do that listening in that case if you find yourself in a power imbalance.
So is there anything that you've seen, any sort of communication style that you've seen in organizations that's well-intentioned but actually has the opposite outcome or bad outcomes?
Well, so I do think that sometimes there is well-intentioned critical feedback that is given that that is given in such a way that it can trigger a defensive response, and that defensive response might not necessarily address the underlying issue, and so it doesn't serve the purpose of the feedback, which was to help the person overcome the issue. So I think that that's one thing. It can be well intentioned to provide purely critical feedback, but in some cases that can result in that unintended consequence. I think that one thing that I've found interesting is asking people how they like to receive feedback. I think sometimes people might not fully be able to answer that question, but at the same time, it does give you a sense of if they want to have a check-in on their performance at a certain time, or if they prefer to get something in writing, or if they prefer to have a conversation. At least asking them about it gives you a sense of what they think would be most helpful to them.
Okay. Thank you. My question is around, you talked about trust and you talked about intent. Yeah. Could you speak to an experience where the intent is good, but how potentially the trust hasn't been developed because of time constraint, because trust is developed over time, and the feedback is probably didn't land as intended? What do you do in that situation where the recipient of person who's getting the feedback, their reaction or response is, or how they receive it is negative for them? However, it wasn't intended bad, but maybe potentially trust hasn't been developed. Like, how do you do that when you know all this information you just provided? However, there are situations that may deviate from that.
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing that I was thinking about when you were speaking was one way you could do that is if you have developed trust with somebody else, you can have a kind of intermediary. So, for example, if somebody else in the organization has developed trust with a given person and you've observed an issue, you could potentially have a group meeting about this issue and have feedback conveyed to the person, less of a one-on-one interaction, but maybe more through that other person, or have a conversation with that other person there. And so you could maybe use another person as a messenger if that trust was developed with other people in the org, but not necessarily between the two people that need to have that interaction to give the feedback.
Let me see. Let's actually go over this guy, but I want to make sure I get the other side of the room.
Yeah, I just have one question. So how does one leader identify another leader? Like if you are managing like 10 people, you know that you have funding, but you need to identify someone who will be co-leading another team, like team of 5 people, and you continue to lead other 5 people. How do you identify who's the next leader?
Well, I think that it probably is situation specific, but given that a leader would have to be somebody who is able to demonstrate this communication adjustment and is able to take on that responsibility of making those decisions and working with their team. So I think I would look for the willingness first of all, the willingness to step into that role, taking on that additional responsibility. Is it something, some people want to be individual contributors and don't want to be in a management position. Some people want to be in a management position. So I think, first of all, taking into account that professional career ambitions and the professional interest in stepping into that leadership role is important. And then I think looking at, as a team member, have they picked up where there's a project management need? Have they stepped into that leadership role? Have they driven decisions when it's been needed to make a decision and there was a lot of uncertainty? How have they handled that? How do they interact with their colleagues? I think all of those things would be taken into account. But I definitely think it's important to think through how have they led, because you can be a leader in your individual interactions or managing sideways. And so who's doing that? Who's just a natural or taken on that responsibility within the team?
How would you say that managing up communication styles might translate for a founder who's actually speaking to an investor or a board member?
Well, let's see. So I think when you're talking to investors and when you're talking to your board members, a lot of the same principles in terms of intentionality really apply. What are the main things that you need to convey in your interaction with this investor or with this founder? So I think oftentimes that investor, they may have other priorities, they may have other things going on. So taking into account their preferences, their ways that they prefer to receive information, that's part of managing up. That would also be, I think, talking with investors and talking with board members. But people are busy, all people are busy, and so I think the intentionality and thinking through ahead of time, okay, what are the specific things that really need to be raised to this investor, and being really deliberate about your communication. That's certainly something that's important for managing up, but also for talking with your investors. These are great questions. Thank you for all the great questions.
You mentioned the analogy of the manager as an umbrella. So how can you both be a good umbrella, but also be clear about the weather?
Yeah, I love that question. So you do definitely need to do both. But I think the umbrella piece is really important for those things that people don't need to know. So if there's some red tape that you're dealing with or your manager is dealing with, and you think you're going to get it straightened out, but it's just a big headache right now, and it's a drain on everybody's time. That's the kind of thing that if it's not impacting your team, the people that report to you, just don't bring them into it and don't bring them down with it. So that would be the umbrella. But if it is something that impacts the future of the company, and it's that there wasn't an investment, or that there wasn't a certain market forecast didn't go your way, I think you have to be straightforward about communicating those kinds of important things, because that ultimately, not doing that will damage trust. And so I think communicating those sorts of important things, that's not, that's the weather, and people are gonna, if it's an important thing that's impacting the company, then people are gonna know about it. So the thing that can happen if you aren't straightforward about it is just that you would lose trust, and then people would find out about it eventually. Yeah, great question.
Did we have a question in the chat?
I think we have.
The presentation didn't talk anything about communication styles of passive versus direct. An example would be this presentation didn't cover a topic versus your presentation didn't cover a topic versus you didn't talk about this. Mm. Do you pay a lot of attention to those differences when you communicate?
I think it can be important. I think it can also factor into the, there was one slide about different formats. So in a written format, for example, people might perceive feedback differently. It's a little bit less critical feedback, for example, could be perceived as less, more passive and less direct if it's in a written form rather than if you came up to somebody and told them, you know, in a one-on-one, face-to-face. So I do think that those mediums of communication are important, and that is something that I think about. I think some people, especially when I think about people that I've worked with, some people do like to have information in writing, for example, and some people prefer to just have a conversation. So I think that those are important, and it gets to how the information is received. So ultimately, you want that information to be internalized. If it's better for the person to receive it in writing, then go ahead and do that. If it's better in a conversation, then I think go ahead and do that. Be my thoughts on that.
One more?
Oh, and there's one more in the front too.
Can I go? Okay. On the last slide, I saw a thing that said inviting people to quit, and it made me wonder, how do you know when it's time to manage out?
Yeah, I saw that one, and I didn't review what that book said about it, because I have read that book, but not recently. I do think just having those, I guess what I would say without knowing specifically what it meant by that is that having those direct conversations about if things aren't working, I think, you know, that can be important to just be straightforward. So it gets into those when you have an issue, you know, think about what you're going to say, be thoughtful about how you deliver the message, but have that conversation about what's not working. And I think ultimately the same sorts of things apply in terms of having built that trust, really trying to see things from somebody else's perspective, and then having that thoughtful communication. Okay. Okay. Well, and I do know that there's at least one person that question I didn't get to, so I'm happy to take some questions I'll be around in the room and happy to take questions afterwards. But thank you so much for your thoughtful questions, and I really enjoyed my time here today.
All right, well, thank you so much for the great talk, Vicki. Really appreciate that. A lot of great nuggets in there, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for the great questions. So just a reminder, next week we have Ken Hornstein from PAC Ventures, Eliza LaCava from Trilogy Equity Partners, and Elizabeth Cross-Nichols from Life Sciences Washington, and they'll be doing a panel on how to talk to investors. Obviously a really important topic for startups, so everyone sign up on CoMotion's website. All right, thank you.